I've been making these small pieces over the last day or two, and I've got to a stage where I'm ready to start working on the surfaces, and I've just been thinking about how I'm going to do that and what that's going to look like. I spent quite a bit of time thinking about it. This shape of piece I really quite enjoy making. They're a bit different for me in that they are sort of horizontal pieces rather than vertical, so the proportions are a bit different, and that's a bit more of a challenge then to think about how the marks are going to go around a form like that. I really like the way that these pieces sit on this sort of smaller base, and it's got a little bit of space underneath which just sort of elevates the piece off whatever it's standing on. So it's got this little gap underneath here. There's also this sort of suggestion that it can maybe move a little bit and rock slightly. These are all sort of variations on that idea, and I like playing around with slight alterations with the proportions, changing the curves, the shape of the piece slightly, and also changing the sort of balance point of the piece and thinking about where the balance point is going to be and what sort of angle that it might sit at. So there's lots of variations on this form that I can explore. But I'm about to start thinking about the surface, and I've done a few drawings in my sketchbook, and I suppose I'm thinking particularly on this page, and I want to use this colour, this sort of yellow colour. That I used this on a piece that I made a few weeks ago, and I really liked it, and it was a colour that I hadn't really used before, and the piece went to a gallery and for an exhibition, and obviously someone else liked it because it sold before the exhibition started, which was good from my point of view. So it's a colour that I think has got a lot of potential. It's a bit unfamiliar for me, so I quite like that challenge of using something that's a little bit unfamiliar. And I've mixed up some different underglazes to get that sort of shade that I want. I've also put a bit of Engobe into this, as well as a bit of red earthenware clay as well, to try and get the right sort of tone. I don't want the pieces to be, I want this yellow colour to be, I don't want it too like a flat sort of yellow. I want it to have variations of tone across the piece. So that's really just my base colour, and then I'm going to alter that and vary it depending on which piece I'm doing and how I'm going to put the colour on. I like this page of drawings as well, and the way that the pieces are predominantly yellow, but there's little accents of other colour, which is a nice contrast for the yellow. So a little bit of green, a little bit of blue, and I've also just started exploring some of the marks that I might put on here, and I'm thinking of these marks as being perhaps scratched in, incised, impressed. There's going to be a bit of texture going on because I'm dealing with a three-dimensional form here rather than in the sketchbook I'm working two-dimensionally. So the marks will change as I actually work on the ceramic pieces. So here are the pieces that I've been working on for the last 2 or 3 hours. I've added different materials. I've added Engobe, slips, bit of underglaze pencil. I've made marks in the surface of the pieces, and they feel like they're coming on. They're certainly not finished because they have to dry out, and then they're going to be fired, and then perhaps more marks and certainly glazes will be added. But in terms of the positioning of the shapes and the marks and the composition of the piece, then that part's pretty much done now. With this piece I decided to make a slightly different shade of yellow, so it's a little bit paler than the rest. Not exactly sure what colour that's going to be when it's fired. It's been a bit experimental, just lightening that yellow, and I wanted a little bit of detail on here, so this is a little sort of stripy detail. I want that. I quite like where I've got a cluster of marks, but also space around it. On this piece I decided to cut the form in two and almost treat the two halves separately. So I've made this gritty texture on this section here and then brushed on the yellow Engobe on this side, and there's if I put it a little bit closer you can see underneath there's a terracotta slip. So this should have some depth to it on this side. It'll be predominantly yellow, but there'll be a little bit of that terracotta colour coming through as well. And there are some runs still showing here where I've put the Engobe on and it was much wetter, so it ran down, and I quite like the evidence of those marks still being here. It's another element to the surface that will make it richer, make it a little bit more interesting. The texture side, I used some ground up bits of clay, ground up bits of dry slip, and I've added those onto the surface and pushed them in. And deliberately, when I put this bit back on, I've just stepped it up a little bit just to create this little edge here, really just to show that that's what I've done, that I did cut it in two, and I have treated each piece separately and put it back together. So it's sort of emphasizing that join by deliberately making that step. The yellow, by the way, will be much, at the moment it looks sort of pastel-y, but it will be a much more intense yellow when it's fired, I hope. It's always a bit of an experiment, but the intention is it'll be a richer yellow. Over here I've used a little bit of mono printing on this piece, and this piece is whiter, so it's only got this strip of yellow. So it's part of this sort of group in that it's got that element of yellow going through it, but I wanted them to be individual pieces. They've got to work in their own right as well. And in this piece it just felt like I needed to have some whiter space on it as well. But the mono printing grid here, mono printed grid, will show up a little bit more when it's fired. And I'm intending at the moment to put a glaze on the bottom section of this piece as well, which will partly cover up these marks and make them a little bit more subtle. So all the time I'm sort of thinking ahead and thinking about what they're going to be like when they're fired and the other treatment that I'm going to do to the surface. But at the moment I'm pleased with them, and they've certainly been good fun to work on. It's been a good 2 or 3 hours. Felt creative, got in a bit of a flow with it as well, which is always nice. And the sun is shining quite nicely on them at the moment. They look good in this light. So they'll dry out, they'll be fired, and then I work on them again with detail of glaze, detail of more lines. But so far so good.